$10,000 in cash. $100 bills, wrapped in a bank rubber band, sitting on a wooden table in Oakland, California. August of 1966. A Monday. The man who brought the money is not famous. You will not find his name in any book about Bruce Lee. You will not find his name in any article. My father knew one of the men who was in the room that day, and he heard the story 3 times across the next 20 years, once from the man himself, and twice from people who had heard it from him. The 3 versions did not fully agree. The bet was simple. 30 seconds. If his bodyguard could last 30 seconds against Bruce Lee, the $10,000 stayed with the man who brought it. If the bodyguard could not, the money stayed on the table. For Bruce. Bruce was 25 years old. He had a wife and a son who was 18 months old. He was 6 months away from moving his family to Los Angeles and changing his life in a way he did not yet know he was going to change it. He looked at the money. He looked at the man who brought it. And he said yes. What happened next, I am going to tell you 3 times. Because that is how it was told to me. A note before we start. This is an artistic story told through the memory of my father. It is built with deep respect for Bruce Lee, his legacy, and the martial arts he gave to the world. Some of it is real and documented. Oakland. Monday morning. August 8, 1966. 82 degrees by noon. A Cadillac parked outside a building that does not have a sign on it. The building is at 4157 Broadway, in Oakland, California. It is a 2-story structure with a garage in the back. 2 years ago, the garage was an auto repair shop. Oil stains on the concrete. A hydraulic lift that someone removed and sold. Now it is a school. There is no sign. There is no character on the door. There is only the street number, painted on the mailbox in black. Bruce Lee and a man named James Lee, no relation, despite the name, opened this school together in 1964. James was older. James had been a welder. James had written a book about iron palm training, which is a real thing, and not a metaphor. James is the reason the school exists in Oakland and not somewhere else. He owns the building. Bruce teaches in it. In August of 1966, the school has maybe 20 students total, and on any given day, 6 or 7 of them show up. It is not a famous place yet. It will not be famous until after Bruce is dead, at which point people who never went there will claim they did. But in 1966, it is a room with mirrors on 3 walls and no windows, a wooden floor that James refinished himself, and a small office in the back with a desk and 2 chairs. That desk. The desk is where the money is going to end up. But first, the car. The Cadillac arrives at 10:45 in the morning. It is a 1965 DeVille, black, polished to the point where you can see your reflection in the fender. The driver is a man in a gray suit and a hat. He does not get out. He sits in the car for 20 minutes with the engine off, the windows down, smoking. In the back of the car, 2 men. The first is the man who brought the money. In every version of the story, he is described the same way. Mid-40s. Expensive suit. Short, maybe 5'7", stocky build. A gold watch. A face that had been handsome 15 years ago and had since become something else. The first version of the story calls him a businessman. The second calls him a real estate developer. The third calls him something less polite, and I am not going to repeat it here, because I do not know if it was true. In all 3 versions, he had money. A lot of it. And he had a problem. The problem was the second man in the back seat. The second man was his bodyguard. 6'4". 260 pounds, maybe 270. A former Marine. The first version of the story says he had been a heavyweight boxer in the service and had knocked someone out cold in the Pacific Fleet Championships in 1958. The second version says he had been a wrestler. Not a boxer. The third version does not specify. What all 3 versions agree on, he was big. He was trained. And he had been the businessman's bodyguard for 4 years, and in those 4 years, he had never once been tested. The businessman had started to wonder if he was paying for something he did not have. He had started to wonder if his bodyguard was a prop. A large man in a suit, who looked threatening, but had never actually done the job. And somewhere, in a bar, in a conversation with a friend who trained out of Oakland, at a dinner where someone said you should see this Chinese kid who teaches in a garage on Broadway, he is something else, he got an idea. He would test his bodyguard. Publicly. Against someone serious. Someone who could not possibly beat a man 60 pounds heavier and 5 inches taller. Someone who, if the bodyguard lost, he lost to an overwhelming physical advantage and could be forgiven for, and if the bodyguard won, well, then the businessman knew he had not wasted 4 years of salary. The Chinese kid who taught in the garage on Broadway. I have to stop here and say something. I do not know if this is why he came. My father heard this reasoning from the man himself, the businessman, years later, in a conversation at a restaurant in San Francisco in 1974, which would have been the year after Bruce died. So the man telling this story to my father's friend was telling it about a man who could no longer contradict him. That is always a problem. That is always a reason to be careful with a story. But the reasoning is what he gave. And I will give it to you the way it was given to me. At 11 o'clock, the 3 men got out of the car. The driver stayed. The businessman and the bodyguard walked across the sidewalk to the door of 4157 Broadway, and the businessman knocked. 3 times. Evenly spaced. James Lee opened the door. James was 46 years old. He had a welder's shoulders and a quiet face. He was not a man who was easily impressed. He looked at the businessman. He looked at the bodyguard behind the businessman. He looked at the Cadillac at the curb. And he said, "Can I help you?" Not a question. A statement. The businessman said he was there to see Bruce Lee. James said Bruce was finishing a workout. The businessman said he would wait. James let them in. Here is the first thing you need to understand about what happens next. Bruce Lee in August of 1966 is not a celebrity. He has done a pilot for a show called The Green Hornet, which has been picked up and which will air for the first time in 5 weeks. But in this moment, he is not on television yet. He is a 25-year-old man with a wife, a toddler, a tiny school, and a reputation among a very small circle of martial artists on the West Coast. Outside that circle, most people have never heard of him. The businessman had heard of him. From someone. That is how this works. Bruce came out of the back room at 11:15. He was barefoot. He was wearing black training pants and a white undershirt. His hair was wet. He had a towel around his neck and a glass of water in his hand. He saw the 2 men standing in the front of the school, the small businessman in the expensive suit, the large bodyguard behind him in a suit that did not fit him as well, and he smiled, a small, polite, neutral smile, the kind of smile you give someone when you have not yet decided what they are doing in your building. He said, "Good morning. Can I help you?" The businessman introduced himself. He said a name. The 3 versions of the story disagree on the name. In one version it was Italian. In one version it was a name that sounded Italian but was not. In the 3rd version, my father said he could no longer remember the name, and he had stopped trying. So I will not give you a name. I will call him the man. The man said he had a proposition. He said he would like to sit down with Bruce privately, if that was acceptable. He said it would take 10 minutes of Bruce's time. He said, at the end of those 10 minutes, there was a very good chance Bruce would leave the conversation with $10,000. Bruce looked at the man. Bruce looked at the bodyguard standing 2 steps behind the man. Bruce looked at James Lee, who was standing off to the side with his arms crossed, and James gave a very small shrug, the kind of shrug that says I have no idea either. And Bruce said, "Okay. Come in the back. There is a small office in the back of the school. A desk. 2 chairs. A filing cabinet that James used to keep receipts. A small fan in the corner, because the garage got hot in August and the office got hotter." Bruce sat on one side of the desk. The man sat on the other. The bodyguard stood by the door. James Lee stood in the doorway, which he later said he did on purpose, because he did not like the feeling of the whole thing. The man took a leather briefcase off his lap. He placed it on the desk. He clicked the two brass locks, and they snapped open. Inside the briefcase, the money. $10,000 in 1966 is worth, in today's money, somewhere between $95,000 and $100,000, depending on how you calculate it. It is not a casual sum. It is, in 1966, roughly a full year's salary for a teacher. It is the price of a modest house in many parts of America. It is more money than Bruce Lee had earned in any single year of his life up to that point. Bruce Lee at 25 had been poor. Not destitute. Not hungry. But close to the edge, in the way that young parents with a small school and a small child are close to the edge. He was teaching private lessons for $100 a month per student. He had maybe 8 private students. He and Linda were living on roughly $800 a month. $10,000 was more than a year of everything he earned. The man closed the briefcase lid but left the locks open. He slid the briefcase across the desk toward Bruce. He said, "I have a proposition. You can say no. If you say no, I leave, and I take the briefcase with me, and we never speak again." Bruce said, "Okay." The man said, "My bodyguard is the man standing behind me. I pay him $200 a week to protect me. I have paid him $200 a week for 4 years. In those 4 years, he has never been tested. I do not know if I am paying for a man or for a coat rack. I would like to find out." Bruce said nothing. He waited. The man said, "I have heard that you are very fast. I have heard that you are better than men who are much larger than you. I do not believe it. I would like to find out." The man reached across the desk. He opened the briefcase again. He took out the stack of bills, $100 bills, wrapped in a bank rubber band, and he placed the stack on the desk between them. He said, 30 seconds. In the front room. My bodyguard. You. If he is standing at 30 seconds, the money goes back in the case, and we leave. If he is not standing, the money stays on the desk. For you." He paused. He added, "No weapons. No strikes to the groin. No biting. Otherwise anything." Bruce looked at the money on the desk. He looked at the bodyguard by the door. He looked at James Lee in the doorway. James said nothing. James's face said nothing. Bruce was 25 years old. He had a wife who was at home with their 18-month-old son. He had 8 private students. He was paying $120 a month in rent. He had, and this is documented, less than $400 in his checking account on that Monday morning. $10,000. He looked back at the man. He said, "Yes." The man smiled. Bruce said, "One condition." The man stopped smiling. Bruce said, "Write it down. Write the terms. Sign it." You sign it, I sign it, James signs it as a witness. So that after, there is no question about what we agreed. The man hesitated for about 2 seconds. Then he nodded. He took a pen from his jacket pocket. James handed him a blank sheet of paper from the desk drawer. The man wrote 4 sentences. The date. The terms. The amount. The signatures. It was a Monday. It was 11:35 in the morning. And 3 men and a bodyguard were about to walk out of a small office in the back of a garage on Broadway into a room with mirrors on 3 walls, and find out which version of the story was going to be true. I am going to give you the first version of what happened next. This version came from the businessman himself. He told it to a man named Charlie Wu, who owned a restaurant in San Francisco on Grant Avenue, in 1974, over dinner, 8 years after the fact and 1 year after Bruce had died. Charlie Wu was a friend of my father's friend, and the story traveled to my father through 2 mouths before it reached him. My father heard this version in 1976. He was 29. He wrote it down in the back of a notebook, which I still have. The notebook has a water stain on the cover and the ink on that page is slightly smudged, but I can still read it. This is the 12-second version. In this version, the businessman described the fight as follows. They cleared the floor. James Lee stood against the east wall with a stopwatch. The businessman stood against the west wall. The bodyguard took off his suit jacket and folded it carefully over the back of a chair. He rolled up his sleeves. He did not take off his shoes, because he was wearing dress Oxfords, and the businessman later said this was the first mistake. Bruce stood in the middle of the floor, barefoot, in his training pants and undershirt. He had not warmed up. He had not stretched. He had finished his own workout an hour before, and in the businessman's telling, he looked relaxed in a way that was not reassuring. He looked relaxed the way a cat looks relaxed on a windowsill 2 seconds before it sees a bird. James said, "Ready." The bodyguard nodded. Bruce nodded. James said, "Go." In the businessman's version, the fight lasted 12 seconds. The bodyguard moved first. He moved the way a large, strong, trained boxer moves, a measured step forward, weight on the back foot, a jab thrown as a rangefinder. Not committed. Testing. In the first second. Bruce did not slip the jab. Bruce did not block the jab. Bruce walked through it. The jab landed on Bruce's shoulder. In the second, Bruce was inside the bodyguard's reach. In the third second, this is the detail the businessman remembered most clearly, and the one my father underlined in his notebook. Bruce hit the bodyguard in the solar plexus with his right hand. Not a punch. Not a chambered strike from a karate stance. A short, dropping, vertical fist from 8 inches away, with his body weight falling into it. A 1-inch punch, essentially, before Bruce had made the 1-inch punch famous in demonstrations. Just a short strike, at close range, with full body weight. In the businessman's telling, the bodyguard made a sound he had never heard a man make before. Not a grunt. Not a yell. A sound like all the air leaving a tire at once. The bodyguard bent forward. Bruce stepped to the side. In the 6th second, the bodyguard was on one knee, trying to breathe. In the 8th second, he was on both knees. In the 10th second, he was on his hands and knees, forehead nearly touching the floor, making a sound the businessman described, years later, at the dinner in San Francisco, as the sound of a man who had just realized something about himself that he did not want to know. At the 12th second, James Lee clicked the stopwatch, looked at the businessman, and said, "He's down." The businessman said nothing. Bruce walked to the corner where his towel was, wiped his face, and sat on the floor cross-legged next to the bodyguard, and waited for him to be able to speak. When the bodyguard could breathe again, which took, by the businessman's count, almost 2 full minutes, Bruce helped him to his feet. He walked him to the chair where his jacket was. He brought him a glass of water. He said, quietly, something that the businessman did not hear clearly but which the bodyguard later repeated, years afterward, to someone else, which is how it entered the chain of the story. Bruce said, "You're strong. You needed to know. Now you know." The bodyguard drank the water. They went back to the office. The businessman signed nothing new. He did not have to. The paper was already on the desk. He opened the briefcase. He lifted it off the desk. He left the stack of bills where it was. He closed the briefcase. He shook Bruce's hand. He said, "A pleasure." And he left. That is the 12-second version. That is the version the man who lost the $10,000 told, 8 years later, at a restaurant in San Francisco, over dinner, to a friend of my father's. It is the fastest version. It is the cleanest version. It is also the version told by the man who paid the money, which means, in a certain sense, it is the version with the greatest interest in making the loss make sense. A man does not lose $10,000 to a stranger and then tell a story in which his own judgment was wrong. He tells a story in which the stranger was extraordinary. In which there was nothing he could have done. In which, in 12 seconds, a man smaller than his bodyguard simply was not from the same world as other men. It may be true. It may be exactly what happened. My father, when he read this version back to me from his notebook in 1991, looked up at me and said, "This is what the man wanted to believe. I don't know if it's what happened. But I understand why he needed it to be what happened." And then he told me the second version. V10. F1A. The second version of the story came from James Lee. James Lee was the man standing in the doorway with a stopwatch. He was the witness with the cleanest seat, closer than the businessman, sober, paying attention, holding the clock in his own hand. James was not a man who exaggerated. James was a welder who had spent 20 years measuring things that had to fit precisely or kill someone, and he carried that habit into the rest of his life. James told this version to a man named Alan Joe, also a co-founder of the school, also a friend of Bruce, at a backyard barbecue in El Cerrito in 1968, 2 years after the fact. Alan Joe told it to a man named Wally J. in 1973. Wally J. told it to a man named Bender at a tournament in San Jose in 1979. Bender knew my father. 4 mouths. 11 years of telephone before it reached the back of my father's notebook. I want you to hold that in your head. Because what James Lee said was 28 seconds, not 12. And those extra 16 seconds changed the whole shape of the story. In James's version, the bodyguard did not throw a measuring jab. In James's version, the bodyguard came in committed. He had been watching Bruce while Bruce was talking with the businessman in the office. He had been watching the way Bruce carried his shoulders, the way Bruce breathed. James later said the bodyguard had clearly been in real fights before, not boxing matches, not exhibitions, but the kind of fights that happen in the parking lots of bars at 1 in the morning. James said you could see it in the way the man stood. He was not afraid. He was reading. When James said go, the bodyguard came forward in 2 long steps and threw a right hand at Bruce's head with everything in him. In James's version, this is the first thing that mattered. The bodyguard did not hold back. He understood, somehow, in the seconds before the fight, that holding back against a man who moved the way Bruce moved would lose him the fight. So he did the thing that very large men with real fight experience do, which is, he tried to end it in one shot. Bruce moved his head 4 inches. The right hand passed through the air where Bruce had been a quarter second earlier. The bodyguard's momentum carried him forward, and as he passed, Bruce hit him in the ribs with a left hook on the way through. This is where James's version gets specific. James said the rib shot did not knock the bodyguard down. The bodyguard absorbed it, grunted, James said, but kept his feet and turned, and came back. This is the moment that does not exist in the businessman's version. In the businessman's version, the fight is a one-strike piece of theater. In James's version, the bodyguard takes the shot, recovers, and comes back. Twice. For the next 19 seconds, by James's count, the 2 men exchanged. The bodyguard threw James estimated 12 to 14 strikes in those 19 seconds. Punches, mostly. 1 attempted clinch. Bruce did not block any of them in the conventional sense. James said Bruce moved the way water moves around a hand in a sink. He was not where the strikes were going to land, by tiny margins, again and again. 2 inches. 3 inches. Sometimes 1 inch. The bodyguard's fists were passing through the air next to Bruce's head, and Bruce was answering with short, hard, accumulating strikes, not finishing strikes, but strikes that were each individually bad to absorb. James said he was breaking him down. Not knocking him out. Wearing him out. By the 23rd second, the bodyguard's hands had dropped. He was breathing through his mouth. There was sweat in his eyes. James said he had hit Bruce once, glancingly, on the left shoulder, and had hit air on every other attempt. At the 25th second, the bodyguard tried one more thing. He stepped in to clinch. He was a wrestler, in this version. He understood that against a striker who was faster than him, his only option was to get hold of him and use the size advantage on the floor. Bruce let him close. Bruce did not back away. Bruce stepped into the clinch, and as the bodyguard's arms came around him, Bruce dropped his weight, hooked one leg, and put the bodyguard on his back on the wooden floor. James said the sound of the man hitting the floor made the mirrors on the wall shake. The bodyguard tried to get up. He got to one knee. Bruce stood over him, hands at his sides, and waited. The bodyguard looked up at Bruce. He looked at the floor. He looked at the businessman against the west wall. He shook his head once and stayed on the knee. At 28 seconds, James clicked the stopwatch. He said, "He's done." In James's version, that is what happened. Not a single strike to the solar plexus and a man on his hands and knees. Not a 1-second demonstration of impossible technique. A real fight. 28 seconds long. Won by attrition and a takedown, against a man who fought back the entire time and was still conscious at the end. I want to say something here. Because this is the version I find the easiest to believe. And I have to be careful, because the version that is easiest to believe is not always the one that is true. It is just the one that fits the shape of the world I already think I live in. In this version, Bruce wins because he is better, but the bodyguard is not a coat rack. The bodyguard is a real fighter who lost to a better fighter. There is no humiliation. There is no magic. There is 28 seconds of two men trying very hard, and at the end of it, one of them is on a knee and the other is standing. That is what most fights actually look like, when they happen between people who can both fight. James told Alan Joe one more thing about that day. He said, when the bodyguard sat down in the chair afterward, and Bruce brought him water, the bodyguard looked up and asked, quietly, so the businessman would not hear, "Where did you learn that takedown?" And Bruce, in James's telling, smiled and said, "My wife's brother. He wrestled in college." The bodyguard laughed. He laughed so hard he started coughing, and Bruce had to pat him on the back. James said it was the first time he had seen the bodyguard's face look like a face that belonged to a person, and not a face that belonged to a job. That is the second version. There is a third version. The third version came from the bodyguard himself. I have to be careful with this one too. Because by the time it reached my father, it had passed through more mouths than the other two, and it is also the version with the most reason to be reshaped along the way. It is the loser's version. It is the version told by the man who had stood in that room and had not been able to do the thing he was paid $200 a week to do. But the bodyguard told it. Years later. To a man who had been his sponsor in a recovery program in Vallejo, California. In the early 1970s. The sponsor told it to a friend, who told it to my father in 1983. The bodyguard's version was 30 seconds. The full 30. He lasted. Now, listen carefully. Because the bodyguard did not say he won. He never said he won. He said he lasted. In his version, Bruce did not knock him down at 12 seconds. Bruce did not put him on the floor at 28 seconds. In his version, and this is the detail I want you to hold, Bruce was playing with him. Not cruelly. Not for show. The bodyguard never said Bruce humiliated him. What he said, years later, in a folding chair in a church basement in Vallejo, was, he could have ended it any time. He didn't. I don't know why. I think he was trying to teach me something. I think he wanted me to find out, in the time we had, what I actually knew how to do. In the bodyguard's version, Bruce did not finish him at 12 seconds because Bruce did not want to finish him at 12 seconds. Bruce wanted 30 seconds of something. Whatever that something was, the bodyguard never quite figured it out. He said Bruce hit him many times. He said none of the strikes were as hard as they could have been. He said when he tried to clinch, Bruce let him almost get hold, and then slipped out, 3 times. He said when he tried to throw the right hand that he had been throwing for 15 years, Bruce slipped it the way a man slips a screen door closing on his face. He said, at the 28th second, he was on one knee not because Bruce had put him there, but because he had run out of breath and he had stopped, and he was looking at the floor and trying to think of what to do next. He said, he looked up, and Bruce was still standing in front of him, hands at his sides, looking at him calmly, waiting. He said, at the 29th second, Bruce reached down and held out his hand. He said, he took it. He said, at the 30th second, he was on his feet, standing next to Bruce, both of them in the middle of the floor, and James Lee clicked the stopwatch and said, by the bodyguard's account, not he's down. Not he's done. But time. Just time. In the bodyguard's version, he had lasted 30 seconds. He had not won. He had not knocked Bruce down. He had not landed a single significant strike. But he was on his feet, by his own choice and by Bruce's hand, when the clock hit 30. By the rules of the bet, the rules written on the paper signed in the back office 20 minutes earlier, that meant the businessman kept his $10,000. I want you to think about that. In the bodyguard's version of the story, the man who lost the fight technically also won the bet. He was on his feet at 30 seconds. The term said, if he is standing at 30 seconds, the money goes back. He was standing. But the money did not go back. Because here is the thing the bodyguard told his sponsor in Vallejo, in the church basement, in 1970-something. And this is the part one cannot prove, and I want to be honest about that. He said, Bruce gave the businessman a choice. He said, Bruce said, in front of everyone, he lasted. The money is yours. Take it. And the businessman, the bodyguard said, looked at his bodyguard, who was breathing heavily, sweat in his eyes, who had been hit 8 or 9 times in the ribs and the head and the shoulders, who was holding a stranger's hand to stay on his feet, and the businessman said, no. Keep it. He earned it. And he left the money on the table. I want to stop here for a second. Because the 3 versions of this story are doing something to me, sitting at my desk in 2025, that they did to my father in 1983 when the 3rd version finally reached him. He sat with all 3 in his notebook for a long time, that year. He used to read them out loud to himself. He told me, much later, that he could not decide which version to believe, and then he said he had stopped trying to decide. Because he had figured out something else. He said, all 3 are true. They are true about 3 different men. And they are all about the same Monday. The first version is the businessman's truth, a man who needs to believe his loss made sense. That he was beaten by something extraordinary and unbeatable, because if he was beaten by an ordinary man having a good day, then the loss was just a loss, and that is harder to live with. The second version is James Lee's truth, a craftsman watching another craftsman, measuring the fight, seeing 2 competent men do their work, neither one mythical, both real. The third version is the bodyguard's truth, a man who had lived, that day, through something he could not quite explain, and who decided, years later, in a chair in a basement, that what had happened to him was not a defeat. It was a teaching. Which one is what actually happened? I don't know. I cannot know. The room had 4 men in it. One of them is dead. 2 of them I never met. The 4th was James Lee, and James Lee died in 1972, before my father could ever ask him directly. This is the kind of story that does not have a true version. It has 3 versions, and they are all true, and they are all wrong, and it happened on a Monday in August in 1966, and the only thing all 3 versions agree on is that it happened. That, and the money. In all 3 versions, when the men left the school that afternoon, the $10,000 stayed on the desk in the office in the back. Wrapped in a bank rubber band. $100 bills. Bruce Lee's, by every version of the story, by everyone who was in the room. What happened to the money next is the 3rd chapter of this video. And it is the part that I have been waiting to tell you, because it is the part that comes back to my father. The men left at 12:45 in the afternoon. The Cadillac pulled away from the curb at 12:48. The driver in the gray suit drove the businessman and the bodyguard back to wherever they had come from, and none of them, by any version of any account, ever returned to 4157 Broadway again. Bruce stayed in the school. He went back to the office. He sat at the desk. James Lee sat in the other chair. The money was still on the desk between them. James later told Alan Joe, and Alan told my father's friend, that they sat in that office for almost an hour without speaking. Not because anything was wrong. Because they did not know what to say. $10,000 on a desk in a small office in the back of a garage on Broadway in Oakland. Bruce, in James's telling, eventually picked up the stack of bills. He weighed it in his hand. He looked at it. He set it back down on the desk. He said, "James, half of this is yours." James said no. Bruce said, "Half of it is yours. You own this building. The fight happened in your floor." James said, "I held a stopwatch. That is not work." Bruce said, "You opened the door for him. If you had said no, none of this happens." James thought about it for a long time. Then he said, "1,500. That covers the floor refinish from last spring, and the fan in this office, and 3 months of utilities ahead. I don't want more." Bruce counted out 15 $100 bills and slid them across the desk. James put them in his pocket. The remaining $8,500 went into a small canvas bank bag that Bruce kept in the desk drawer. He carried it home that afternoon, walking, because in 1966 he did not own a car. Linda Lee, who in this story stays at home, which is where she actually was that day with their son, opened the door, and Bruce came in, and he set the bag on the kitchen table, and he said, "We need to talk about Los Angeles." 6 months later, in February of 1967, Bruce, Linda, and Brandon moved from Oakland to Los Angeles. Bruce had been thinking about the move for almost a year. The Green Hornet had finished its first season. There was film work. There were students in Los Angeles who could pay more than students in Oakland. The move required a deposit on an apartment, money to break the Oakland lease, gas for 2 trips down with a borrowed truck, and a financial buffer to survive the first 3 months in a city where they did not yet know anyone. The move cost, by Linda's later account, in a financial document that became part of estate records after Bruce's death, somewhere around $6,000 total. It was paid for, in full, in cash, from the canvas bag in the kitchen. That, more or less, is the documented part. That, more or less, is what I can tell you with reasonable confidence. What is not documented, what is only in the third version of the story, the version that came through the longest chain, is one more detail. The bodyguard said years later, asked Bruce for one thing before he left the school that afternoon. He asked Bruce to write something down on a piece of paper. He asked Bruce to write, and the bodyguard said this in the church basement in Vallejo, 3 words. He wanted them in Bruce's handwriting. He wanted them on paper. He wanted to keep it. And Bruce, in this version, took the same pen the businessman had used to sign the bet 20 minutes earlier. He took a fresh sheet of paper. He wrote the 3 words. He signed his name underneath. He folded the paper in half. He gave it to the bodyguard. The bodyguard kept it. He kept it for the rest of his life. When he told this story in the basement in Vallejo, his sponsor asked him what were the 3 words. The bodyguard reached into his wallet. He had carried the paper, folded, in his wallet since August of 1966. By the time he showed it to his sponsor in the early 70s, the paper was thin enough to see light through. The fold had cracked. The ink was fading. But you could still read what Bruce had written. The 3 words were, "You were honest." Signed, BLE. 8/8/66. That is what the bodyguard said. I cannot prove the paper exists. I have never seen a photograph of it. The bodyguard died sometime in the late 1980s, and what happened to his wallet, I do not know. The sponsor in Vallejo died in 2004. The man who told the story to my father died in 2011. The paper, if it ever existed, is gone. But here is the thing. My father, the first time he heard the third version of the story, in 1983, when he was 36 years old, he did not say anything for a long time. We were in the kitchen. I was 15. He was making coffee. He had just come back from a conversation with the friend who had heard the story from the man who had heard it from the sponsor. He stood at the counter. He poured the coffee. He looked out the window at the neighbor's yard. He said, finally, and this is the line of his that I have carried for 42 years. 3 people told me the story. None of them lied. None of them remembered it the same. That's how you know it really happened. He turned around. He looked at me. He said. If everyone agreed, that's when I'd be suspicious. He drank his coffee. That was the only thing he ever said to me about the Oakland bet. He never told me which version he believed. I asked, once, in 1991, when I was reading his notebook. He shook his head. He said, all three. None of them. It doesn't matter. The thing it teaches is the same in all three. I asked, what does it teach? He thought about it. He said, that a man can do a hard thing and not need to be sure he did it for the right reason. Bruce took the money. He needed it. He also fought a man for 30 seconds without breaking him when he could have. He gave him 3 words on a piece of paper because the man asked. All of those things are at the same time. You don't have to choose between them. He drank the rest of the coffee. He said, most stories ask you to choose. The good ones don't. I am at my desk. It is November. The afternoon light is orange on the wall behind my monitor. I have my father's notebook open next to me, the one with the water stain on the cover, the one with the smudged page where he wrote out the 12-second version in 1976. I have been turning a piece of paper over in my hand for the last 20 minutes. It is not the bodyguard's paper. The bodyguard's paper is gone, if it ever existed. This is something else. When my father died in 2017, I went through his desk. In the bottom drawer, in a manila envelope marked Oakland, there were 3 pages of notes about this story, the 3 versions, in his handwriting, dated and labeled. And underneath the 3 pages, folded in quarters, there was one more piece of paper. It was a sheet from a yellow legal pad. The fold was old. The paper had yellowed further. On it, in my father's handwriting, not Bruce's, in blue ballpoint pen, copied from what he said his friend told him the bodyguard had shown the sponsor in Vallejo. 3 words. You were honest. And underneath, in smaller letters, in my father's hand. D. Lee. 8/8/66. He had copied it. He had copied the bodyguard's paper from a description, secondhand, of a paper he had never seen, which itself may not have existed, and he had folded it and kept it in a manila envelope in the bottom drawer of his desk for 30 years. I am holding it now. I do not know if Bruce Lee ever wrote those 3 words on a piece of paper in Oakland in August of 1966. I do not know if a bodyguard kept it in his wallet for 2 decades. I do not know if any of the 3 versions of the fight is fully true. The room had 4 men in it. One is dead since 1973. One since 1972. One since the late 80s. The 4th, the businessman, is unknown to me by name. What I know is, my father heard a story 3 times. He wrote down 3 versions. He kept a copy, in his own hand, of 3 words from the 3rd version that he had never seen for himself. He kept it in an envelope marked Oakland. He kept it for 30 years. He did not show it to me while he was alive. Last week, holding the paper, I called my mother. I asked her if she had ever seen the envelope. She said no. I asked her if she knew why he had kept it. She thought about it. She said, your father believed that some stories were worth keeping in the house. Even if you couldn't prove them. Especially if you couldn't prove them. She said, he used to say, the ones you can prove, everyone has. The ones you can't, those are yours. That is the line. That is the line I am going to leave you with this week. The Oakland bet happened on a Monday in August of 1966. 3 men told the story afterward. Their versions did not agree. $10,000 left a black Cadillac in a leather briefcase and ended up, $8,500 of it, in a canvas bag on a kitchen table, where it eventually paid for a family's move to Los Angeles, which led to everything else that you know about Bruce Lee, the films, the philosophy, the death, the legend. The other $1,500 paid for a fan, a floor refinish, and 3 months of utilities in a small school in Oakland that does not exist anymore. And, possibly, somewhere, 3 words on a piece of paper, signed and dated August 8, 1966, in a wallet that no longer exists, copied out in my father's hand 30 years later, sitting in my desk drawer right now. You were honest. That is what my father chose to keep. That is what I am keeping now.